Happy to introduce tonight and have with us Robert McKersie, Professor Emeritus of the MIT Sloan School of Management, an Arlingtonian, as well as the author of a new book from Southern Illinois University Press, A Decisive Decade, an Insider's View of the Chicago Civil Rights Movement during the 1960s.
Good to be here.
Thank you for being on.
Thanks, Peter.
Back to 1959. You had graduated from Harvard Business School. You got an appointment at University of Chicago.
Right.
So you, in a sense, you were there at the very dawn of the 60s in Chicago, and not necessarily expecting to get involved in this burgeoning civil rights movement. So how did you get involved both in academia and teaching at UChicago, as well as in the civil rights movement as it started there in the 60s?
Well, it was a kind of step-by-step journey. I was teaching a course in collective bargaining. I had a student who was studying a strike by some African-American workers at two local hospitals. Mm-hmm. And that was mainly my early field of labor management relations. Mm-hmm. The workers had struck because management wouldn't recognize them. Sure. And I got really interested in the leadership and the cause that they were pursuing, which was partly labor relations, partly, in a sense, uplifting, in a sense, the status of African Americans. Mm-hmm. So that was the first step. And then through the church where I was very active, mm-hmm. I met several leaders of what was the developing civil rights movement mm-hmm. in Chicago. And they said, hey, Bob, you've got some skills, help us strategize some of our campaigns. So one by one, I sort of got involved in some of the campaigns.
For many of us, from a historical standpoint, we think of Chicago really as a place where Black Americans sought refuge from the bitter racism of the South. But certainly in 1960s, Chicago, I think you remarked in the book, was the most segregated large city in the United States. So how do those two visions of Chicago square?
Well, I think it came about with the development of the steel industry and meat packing and some of the other industries mm-hmm. that pulled workers from the South who were looking for opportunities. And they came in tremendously large numbers mm-hmm. During the early years of the 1900s, 1920, 1930, mm-hmm. and so on. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there was enough housing around the general area of Chicago, so they sort of piled up on two sides, the mm-hmm. south side and west sides of Chicago. Just filling up these existing buildings. Some of them originally in white areas, but then the whites started to move away, moving further out. Mm-hmm. So the blacks became, in a sense, the sort of workforce, the labor mm-hmm. force of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And there was also a lot of efforts to keep them in those areas and not let them, in a sense, go to the north side. Right. Of Chicago. One
of the challenges, I imagine, and I think you draw it out well in A Decisive Decade, is that your real entree into the civil rights movement seemed to be the church that you were a part of, the First Unitarian Church of Chicago, as well as the University of Chicago.
Right.
Both largely white establishment organizations.
Right.
And the question being, how were they perceived by the civil rights movement, by the members, the rank and file members of the civil rights movement, and thereby, how were you perceived as a person working in those organizations?
Well, starting with the University of Chicago, the perception of the university was not too good within the black community or on the part of the leaders. Mm. In fact, there was a community organization just to the south of the university that was constantly challenging the university to do more mm-hmm. For that community. And one of the first events of the civil rights movement in Chicago was a sit-in by students against the administration of the mm-hmm. university mm-hmm. because they were not renting in their apartments that they owned nearby to African Americans. Right. So the university was not seen in a good light, at least in the early 1960s. Right. So my presence as a professor coming from the university did create, in a sense, some questions. The Unitarian Church was quite different. It was very integrated. Right. And as I mentioned, the reason I got into the movement was that there were a couple of the key leaders of what was then the developing movement, very active in the church. We had this discussion group, and we were discussing like that sit-in by the students at the university and other issues that were developing. So being a member of the church was not a bar. In fact, that was my gateway into the movement.
The beginning of the 60s, you're a new member of the U Chicago faculty.
Right.
You're, as you could say in the book, you're, quote, bucking for tenure. And my sense is there's got to be some tension around securing that tenure and securing the good graces of the university, and at the same time being true to your sense of where the civil rights movement and your place in it needs to go. How did you resolve that tension?
Well, you're putting your finger on a really big dichotomy between what people expected I would be doing as a young assistant professor, teaching and doing research, and then my activities in the civil rights movement. And I got a lot of people saying, hey, Bob, are your priorities right? You're endangering your chances for tenure, not just because I was taking time away from what they saw, as the right priorities, but also because I might, in a sense, get my name in the newspaper if I got arrested or something, and that would quickly say to them, hey, this guy isn't really serious about an academic career. He's off, on this crusade. So it was. And I had to think hard about that over the years, Peter, because it was a real dilemma.
It strikes me that from what you wrote, maybe a turning point of sorts was 1963. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Was in jail. He writes Letter from Birmingham Jail, and this is his clarification.
Right.
What is going on? Why it is that Black America needs to make a statement at this time in this way. Can you speak to how Letter from Birmingham Jail clarified for you that which is very difficult, if not impossible, for white Americans to know, and that is the experience of Black Americans?
The experience, and also I think the urgency to get on with change. Right. So often people had been told, well, change is happening, and there had been some improvement. President Truman had integrated the armed forces, and there was the decision, Brown versus et cetera, that was in the 50s. Yep. So people were saying, be patient. And King was saying, look, the problems, the discrimination, is so intense, so big, that we just can't be patient. Right. And we've got to get on, and we've got to be provocative. I think one of the things he was trying to say to other ministers who really believed, in discussion and conciliation, I'm going to have to, in a sense, flash out the opposition. I'm going to have to, in a sense, make things tense, make things, in a sense, unpleasant. And that's the only way we're going to get changed.
How do you come down on the civil rights movement and its impact on Chicago and the situation of Black Americans there?
Well, the way I think I would answer that question, Peter, is that the civil rights movement moved through different targets. One target, of course, was employment, trying to open up more jobs for African Americans. And I was heavily involved in a campaign against one large company that obviously was discriminating against Black workers who were there seeking employment. I think there we made quite a bit of progress. And I think the business community, even thinking about that since the 60s, has probably moved very well in terms of being inclusive and welcoming people of color. The second target area was education, where the minority kids were all piled up in neighborhood schools, and rather than letting them move over to white schools where there are vacancies, they brought in these trailers called Willis wagons after Superintendent of Schools Willis. Right. There, we didn't make as much progress. The superintendent just stuck to neighborhood policy, and he was backed by Mayor Daley, and nothing really changed for the moment. And I think even today, education is a big challenge in Chicago. When we moved to housing, which was the focus that Martin Luther King brought when he came in the summer of 1966, they did reach a summit agreement that committed the real estate agencies and the city to try to make more homes open. And I think it is the case in Chicago. If you have the means, if you have the income, you can live anywhere. You can live in Winnetka. You can live, so there's been some progress there. Now, the fourth area, I think there's been a lot of progress, and that was with Jesse Jackson's Operation Breadbasket organization, where he wanted to open up shelf space for a lot of these small suppliers. People were making wax, drain cleaner, Joe Louis milk, interesting name to put on a milk product. There we also saw a lot of progress, both for those companies as well as for workers going into those retail stores. So I think you have to, in a sense, break it down. And I would say, yes, quite a bit of progress. There are some people who have written about it when they look at all of the demonstrations and the rallies and they say, what did we get for it? And they're a little more pessimistic. Maybe because I was close to it and working hard to have some of these things make a difference, I may be a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more biased.
Well, I think certainly in the area of consciousness, the decade did a lot to move things.
Well, and if you go to the national level, I mean, I was focusing primarily on what could be related to the action of the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, we got a number of key pieces of legislation. In 1965, we got the Civil Rights Act. 1966, we got the Voting Rights Act, which has been in newspapers recently because there's been some efforts to kind of weaken some of the provisions. We did not get the Housing Act in 1967 when it was first proposed, but unfortunately, it took Martin Luther King's death in 1968, and then it was passed. Then we got, at the national level, a Fair Housing Act. So you can say the 60s gave us some legislation, gave us some new laws that have made a difference.
You're bringing up Martin Luther King there. Brings me back to one of the passages in the book that I found particularly meaningful, and that is at your church's memorial service for Dr. King. You were agitated. I think it's fair to say that that's sort of the characterization you gave your feeling there, that any eulogy provided by a white member of the Unitarian congregation could not possibly capture the sense of loss that was experienced then, there, as well as across the country, I would imagine. And at the same time, it would have been impossible for a Black American to speak to the congregation and really tell it like it was. That the etiquette of the day would have not allowed that. So I'm wondering if half a century later, if we can say that we've learned at all how to bridge this rift and understand a little bit more about how it is to be in someone else's skin. Do you think we've made progress in this?
We've made some progress, Peter, but we have to think what was going on with the Trayvon Martin and the gentleman, Mr. Zimmerman, who was acquitted, because I think a lot of whites, and to some extent myself, it was very hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of this young man, Trayvon Martin. And it took President Obama to speak up and say, look, I could have been Trayvon Martin. You folks don't realize that when someone of a person of color walks down the street, the clicks go on the door locks of their cars, or people cross the street. So it's so hard for us. So here we are, 2013, and the gap is much more subtle. It's based on assumptions. It's based on things that are very hard to talk about.
And let me interrupt and say, relative to this, because I saw on the WBUR website a beautiful piece that you wrote in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And one of the pullouts there was, as a nation, we're past the need to discuss things like separate drinking fountains. But when it comes to talking about young Black men in hooded sweatshirts, we still have a long way to go.
It's often, we had a commission that our President Bill Clinton commissioned. We had John Hope Franklin, a distinguished Black historian who chaired a commission back when Clinton was president. And the whole theme of it was, how do we have a conversation across the racial divide? How do we do that? So it's proximity, it's integration, it's conversations, and it's patience.
Right. So after your experience in Chicago in the 60s and subsequently, you are hopeful that we can continue to make progress.
It's a work in progress. Yeah, we just need to continue. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, the book is A Decisive Decade. I would personally recommend the book rack on Medford Street in Arlington. I know they can order it for you if they don't have it. I talked to them. Also, certainly Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, et cetera, et cetera. The author is Robert McKersie. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Peter.
Absolutely. I'm sure our viewers will as well. And I'm Peter Bermudez for Arlington Public News. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, it's Susan Karp. I'm the Executive Director of the Arlington Council on Aging and host of Living Out Loud. Welcome back. I'd like to tell you about fuel assistance. Don't be cold this winter. The Fuel Assistance Program begins November 1st and ends on April 30th. If you have any questions, give us a call at the Council on Aging, 781-316-3400. Don't be cold.
Professor Joseph is a professor of history at Tufts University and is the author and editor of several books, including Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama, and Stokely, A Life, a biography of Stokely Carmichael, available next month. He's also a graduate of Temple University and the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts, as well as a leading historian of the Black Power movement. Welcome, Professor Joseph.
Hey, thank you for having me, Peter.
I think a reasonable place to start in our conversation about Black Power is to get a working definition. What is Black Power?
Black Power really relates to the way Stokely Carmichael and other activists articulated it in the 1960s, is really social, political, cultural, economic self-determination on behalf of the African American community. So when we think about this notion of Black Power, it was Black people defining their own politics, Black people defining what identity meant, and also what were the goals, strategies, and tactics to achieve racial equality, economic justice in the United States and abroad.
It's a large agenda.
It's a large agenda. And people had, what's interesting is people had different ways of going about this. So somebody like Stokely Carmichael certainly is a political revolutionary. Although initially he is an advocate of radical democracy. He is working on voter campaigns. He's working with the Democratic Party. He moves away from that and starts his own independent organizing. So you had certain Black Power activists who were advocating class struggle, Marxist-Leninism. You had certain Black Power activists who were saying, let's work within the system and we need more Black faces in higher places. Now they tended to be more conservative and they tended to believe, Richard Nixon in 1969 says he's fine with Black Power as long as it's Black capitalism. Right? So there's definitely different versions of Black Power, but certainly the overall thrust is really for radical social political justice.
The misunderstandings surrounding the Black Power movement, they seems to have sort of two primary sources. I think one is the rhetoric and the style of members of the organization itself. Yeah. And the other could be focused on sort of the shaping and the misshaping of the media of the day and the white establishment.
Yes, activists at times were too hyperbolic. One, it's the historical context. It's a context of race relations in the 1960s and early 70s, much different than right now. So it's a context of demonstrations, but also urban uprisings, or what people call riots, police brutality. It's an era of political assassinations. So at times, activists, were both bold and speaking truth to power, but at times they were purposefully inflammatory. The whole idea of, America, if America doesn't come around, it's going to burn to the ground, was designed to provoke and to shock.
Well, certainly it had that effect. I think that it's fair to say that certainly a large part of white America is fearful by the rhetoric. Now, was that to a certain extent intentional insofar as it empowered and made clear to the Black community that yes, we do hold power, even if in the face of police forces, in the face of politics, we don't hold such power.
I think it was designed to tell the truth, in the sense of what people wanted to do was boldly speak truth to power. So in this sense, talking about white racism, right? Carmichael and Hamilton in their book Black Power in 1967, they coined the term institutional racism, right? Like we didn't have that in our lexicon. Those were big ideas at the time. This idea of that, it wasn't about personal prejudice, it was about institutional systems and about white privilege, right? That did scare and provoke people, but I think Black Power activists, Black Power radicals felt that Black people were being subjugated and there was racial oppression running rampant anyway, that the civil rights movement hadn't really been as transformative as it needed to be. So this call for Black Power was going to be what finally provided a context and a politics of empowerment.
Most of our history textbooks place Martin Luther King sort of front and center. We are a culture that likes to see one person out in the front. However, certainly your work is suggesting that the Black Power movement more generally not only helped organize the African American community in the 1960s, but really set the foundation for Barack Obama's election in 2008.
What I'll say there is that in my book, Dark Days, Bright Nights, I make the argument that it's not just civil rights that transforms the racial landscape and the political landscape of the United States of America. It's also the Black Power movement. And the argument I make is that when we think about Black Power, there are many different iterations of Black Power. So things like Black student unions, for example, the creation of Black studies departments, this all created a landscape that provided more equality, that provided Black elected officials. All these things really owed themselves not just to civil rights, but to the Black Power movement, which was very consciously trying to build this struggle for racial solidarity and get more Black political, social, economic power.
A comment that I think is attributed to Stokely Carmichael in terms of his feeling that, and I paraphrase, that America will never extend equality to all of its people. What are your comments on that? The sense of hopelessness that America can live up to, hopefully, what its mission is.
Well, yeah, I think that's obviously it's a harsh critique, and I understand why he would say something like that. But I mean, I think those of us who are interested in racial justice, economic justice, we have to be more hopeful even than that. So I mean, part of the reason why you wake up in the morning and you get up to struggle is that there's going to be social, political transformation in the United States. So I think we have to understand sort of the difference between an activist giving sort of a harsh denunciation and really their own hopes and dreams. I think one of the reasons why Carmichael was so critical of American society is because his experience as a civil rights activist, even before he's a Black Power revolutionary, is very, very deep. He's in Mississippi, he's in Alabama. On the day-to-day, he's getting arrested dozens and dozens of times, right? When he does the Black Power speech in 1966, June 16th in Mississippi, he says, this is the 27th time I've been arrested. He's just been released from jail. And this is just for nonviolent civil rights activism, right? So he's been at Howard University doing sit-ins. He's been in Cambridge, Maryland. He's been tear gassed and brutalized by police. So it's very interesting. Those kind of experiences really shape him. And one of the reasons I wrote the book on Stokely is because Stokely is really the only Black Power activist who's a major Black Power figure who had that extensive experience during the heroic period of the civil rights era, right? So he's not just sort of coming out of nowhere and saying this. I mean, he knows who Martin Luther King Jr. is. They're friends. He goes to his house for dinner, and he knew him since 1963. He had met Malcolm X as early as 1961, helped organize Malcolm's visit to Howard University. So this is somebody who knows who Fannie Lou Hamer is. Fannie Lou Hamer is the sharecropper turned activist who's part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And those were Stokely's people. So his activities are very, very profound in the sense that he was organizing with some of the poorest people on the planet. You talk about African-American sharecroppers in Mississippi and Lowndes County, Alabama. They're living in feudal conditions that are just like so-called third world conditions right here in the United States in the 1960s. These are people who had no birth certificate, would never have a certificate of death. So that's who he was organizing, right? So it's not just sort of urban militants in Harlem or Oakland and things like that.
What can the white community today do to be allies to people in the Black community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think right now what we've had occur in sort of this post-civil rights period, this post-Black Power period, this period of Obama, is that we've seen increased racial stratification in the United States, increased racial segregation, but it's not de facto, it's not de jure segregation. It's not by law, right? It's de facto. Michelle Alexander has a book called The New Jim Crow, and Michelle is a friend of mine, and we brought her to Tufts, and she was talking about New Jim Crow, mass incarceration. I extend that metaphor to really our daily lives, where we still have Jim Crow, a rigid system of black, white, separate, and unequal, and there are other ethnicities involved, but they all fall along a continuum of race between those black-white poles. So I think one thing that white citizens of sort of good conscience can do is, one, be informed and find out, like, why is there still racial disparity and institutional racism in the United States, and what's our recent history? But not just our recent history in terms of civil rights, but also things like antebellum slavery. You know, the movie 12 Years a Slave, I've written extensively about that for different publications. And one of the reasons I think that's so profound, it provides us a different, renewed understanding that racial slavery is at the heart of our narrative as a nation, right? So once we come to terms with that, you're in a much better position. And then finally, I mean, this idea, before getting into sort of tactics and nuts and bolts, this idea of white privilege. There is a privilege of being white in a racially stratified society, right? So it doesn't mean that any white person is personally bad or should feel any kind of guilt, but they certainly should understand what the privilege is of having this identity that institutions and other people respond to differently than people who are African American or people who are darker skinned, right? So I think that's part of it. And then it becomes, at the local level, you know, Arlington, I did the keynote for the MLK celebration. It becomes reaching out to other people. I mean, at Tufts we have the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, and we're you know, interested in multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-generational you know, dialogue and research and intellectual conversation about these issues. So it's saying at the local level, you know, reaching out to groups like that, you know, to try to do some of that work together, because I think that there are a lot of people who want to rethink this idea of racial integration in the 21st century, because they're growing up in a world where, even though there are not black and white signs for water fountains and swimming pools, there might as well be, because the neighborhoods are so racially homogeneous. Schools are, friendship circles are, so blacks and whites are still likely to, you know, live, work, and die apart rather than together.
As I said, you've got this, yes. Stokely A Life. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Certainly a compelling read. If there's anything more that would be good for our viewers to know about the Black Power movement, about the work of your center?
I think Stokely really connects to the way in which I look at my work now in terms of the evolution of my work, because I'm very interested in issues of race and democracy at the local, national, and global level. And certainly what Stokely Carmichael was trying to do in the 1960s and the larger civil rights movement, larger Black Power movement, was really transform American democracy, make these democratic institutions work. We all know these institutions aren't perfect. And in the case of civil rights activists, they were willing to go to jail and demonstrate to try to transform those institutions. In the case of Black Power activists, they wanted to demonstrate, sit in, and by any means necessary, fix those institutions. So I think that these ideas of race and democracy are very, very important, and people who are interested in that should, you know, try to connect with the center, try to read, you know, Stokely and these other books, but really think to themselves that part of being an active citizen is really understanding that relationship between race and democracy, and really race, class, and democracy, gender, sexuality in our country.
If you like this interview, I invite you to go to the Arlington Public News website, where you can find Dr. Joseph and many others comment on what Black History Month means to them. And here's hoping that every month can lead us to a rich history that instructs and nourishes us all, regardless of skin color or any other distinction. For Dr. Peniel Joseph, I'm Peter Bermudez for Arlington Public News.